are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is the solved case of the fast food killer, in which 2 survived. Now, whether you are not wanting to cook dinner or in need of a quick lunch, fast food has always been something that people rely on, that they find is easy accessible. However, that would quickly turn to fast food restaurants being a place people were scared to go. And that was all within months. Now, this case also involves 2 people who found the strength in them to fight back and who actually kept their lives. By the way, I post so much content like this. It's my absolute passion to tell these stories, and I mean no harm or disrespect when I do so. So if you'd like to support me in doing that, all you have to do is make sure you are subscribed, give this video a thumbs up, and leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to this story. It was 1997 in Tennessee, and 16-year-old Sarah Jackson was working at the Captain D's restaurant in Nashville. This was in the Donaldson neighborhood of Tennessee, and that is where she would have one of her first jobs. This was just a part-time job for Sarah, who was still going to school, and she had been working there for about 8 months at this time, but she was also going to school and participating in extracurricular activities such as volleyball and softball, but she could still be a very hard worker at this Captain D's, and she had actually made enough money to buy herself her first car, and she was extremely proud of doing so. So on the morning of February 16th, she drove her brand new car to her job. It only took about 10 minutes to get there from her home, so she arrived about 8:40, and she was really excited for the work day ahead, as much as you can be for work, but she was going to be working with her boss, which was Steve Hampton. Now, he was 28 years old. He was said to be a wonderful boss. He was also a husband and a father of 3. Everything would be going according to plan as they set up for the lunch rush that day. However, when the next employee would come to the restaurant to check in for her shift, she realized that the doors were still locked, and she figured maybe they were still setting up and they just had forgotten to unlock the doors. But she knew customers would be coming soon, so she began to knock a little bit louder, and still nobody was answering. And that is when she peered in the door and saw that the chairs were still up on the tables like they had done at closing the previous night. And this was very strange that they hadn't even put the chairs down yet. So she began to call inside the restaurant, hoping that that would get Steve and Sarah's attention, but they didn't answer. And so she decided to call the police as well as the lead manager who had another key to let her in. And by 9:30, he would get there along with the police, let them in, and they would be walking around in practically a ghost town. It appeared as though, some of the preparations had been done for, opening the restaurant, but not all of them had. It appeared as though they had just been stopped in the middle of it, and they couldn't find them anywhere. Unfortunately, that is when they would get to the back freezer, and they would find 2 bodies lying face down on the floor with blood surrounding them, and they instantly knew that this was Steve and Sarah, and they had been shot several times execution style. Now, the only other, strange thing in this restaurant was that the cash register and the safe were open, and a total of $7,500 had been stolen. So the motive at this point was thought to be robbery. Steve's wallet had been missing as well, and at this point investigators had to do what they all dreaded the most, and they had to go inform Steve and Sarah's families, and they did so, and they had to tell them that they probably didn't even have a chance to react, that they were just filled with fear as they were rushed back to this cooler and their lives were taken. Now, when they went to talk to Steve's wife, she said that Steve actually had $600 in his wallet that day because he was going to pay their rent with it, which would, point to why it was missing. But investigators also realized, looking back at Captain D's in the actual building, that the door had been locked. on the way out, as though this killer had done so and thought about it prior to leaving. This made the investigators believe that they were possibly dealing with an experienced killer or robber. That was the only clue they had to go on at this point, because there weren't any security cameras in or around Captain D's. So they went to their next best bet, and they started talking to the other employees at Captain D's, especially the ones who had worked the shift the night before this happened, and they would interview them to see if there was anything strange that they saw, anyone strange that they saw. And a few of them had said that right before closing, a man had actually walked in and had asked them for an application. He said that he was a chef and that he wanted to work at Captain D's, and they handed him this application, and that is when he left shortly after. There was no strange altercations or anything like that, but that was just the last customer that they saw, and so they wanted to tell investigators about this. And so, since this was technically the last customer to ever be in this restaurant, they started focusing on this man. They asked the staff who had been working there and who had seen this man to flip through some photos of criminals in the area to see if they could identify him through there, and when they couldn't, they said he wasn't in any of these photos. They had them work with a sketch artist to see what he really looked like, to spread this photo around to see if he could be identified through the public that way. And they would all come up with the same description, that he was a white male who was large, tall, muscular, and he was also thought to be in his 20s or his 30s. A witness would come forward at this time saying that she had driven past Captain D's on her way to church that morning, and that it was really early before, any of the restaurants would have been open, so she noticed that there was somebody outside of Captain D's. There was this man, but she also knew Steve Hampton, and he had opened the door for this man. He was kind of holding it open with his foot as he took a piece of paper from him. And of course, after that, she drove by and didn't see anything else. But another witness would say that around 9:20, he saw a man who matched this description leaving Captain D's. Could this have been the same man from the night before, and was this his plan all along, to get an application and to use that as an in to get back in the restaurant before it even opened? These were questions that were important but didn't matter as much as identifying this killer, and at this point they truly didn't know where to go next. But that was when they would get a phone call from a man who said he had been picking up cans on the side of the highway. This was about 11 miles away from Captain D's, and it was a pretty busy highway, and he had said that he found Steve Hampton's cards. It was, his credit cards, his ID, his, shopping cards, and they all said his name. And he had found these and thought that it was important for the investigation, so he turned them in. Of course, no cash from his wallet was found. In fact, his wallet itself wasn't found, just these cards, as though those had been thrown out and the cash in the wallet had been kept. But the cash wasn't necessarily what investigators were looking for anyway. They were actually really excited about the possibility of these cards being found from being in the killer's hands, because they were hoping they could lift a fingerprint from it. So they took these cards in for testing, and that is when they would find a partial fingerprint on them, and this did not belong to Steve, so there was a good chance it was the killer's. However, they ran it through the state's database, because I'm pretty sure at the time they could only do the state and not, on a national level. And so they did this, and unfortunately, no one came up as having a criminal record who had this fingerprint. So they were still back at square one. A witness then also came forward saying that they had seen a man walking around the area of the crime scene around that time wearing a Shoney's apron. And a Shoney's, if you don't know, is a restaurant as well. And so investigators immediately went to Shoney's and decided to interview all of the employees to see if they found anything off, or anyone that was experiencing some strange behavior or who hadn't come to work. They talked to managers, employees, everyone, and they didn't find anything odd. So once again, nothing was coming up in their favor. They were not finding a killer. And Captain D's actually decided to close down for a while, and on their sign outside it said, "Closed in memory of Steve and Sarah." The community in Nashville were horrified. They had no idea what to even make of this, because Nashville was not a place where they had to, fear things like this happening. And it was really such a community. Everyone, even though it's kind of a big area, everyone felt like they were friends and family, that they were comfortable. And this just completely threw them for a loop. And it would just continue to get worse from here. 1 month later, it was March 23rd, and this would be 2 miles away from Captain D's. And it would be at a McDonald's on Lebanon Road. And that is where 911 would get a call that night. And all they could hear on the other side of the line was a faint whisper saying, "Please, please, please." They tried to ask them questions and they couldn't respond, and that is when police were sent to check things out. All the lights were shut off inside the McDonald's, but they could see movement inside, and so they broke in through a window and they rushed in to see blood everywhere. There were bodies in the back storeroom, and there were actually 4 of them. They were still wearing their McDonald's uniform. It was 17-year-old Andrea Brown, 27-year-old Ronald Santiago, who was actually the manager of this McDonald's, as well as 23-year-old Robert A. Sewell. And they were all shot in the back of the restaurant in the storeroom. However, there was still another employee inside who was not dead. It appeared as though all of these employees had been lined up before being shot execution style, but they saw a twitch on this 4th employee, and they immediately called an ambulance because he was still hanging on to life. He was 30-year-old Jose Antonio Ramirez Gonzalez, and he was bleeding profusely. He was immediately rushed to the hospital, and they quickly found that he had not been shot like the rest of the employees. He had actually been stabbed 17 times. Investigators feared that this could be the same man that had killed Steve and Sarah, who had just now claimed 3 more lives, and one who is in critical condition at the Vanderbilt University Hospital. And investigators also found that, just like at Captain D's, McDonald's was missing money to the amount of $2,300. Now, at this point, Jose was the only witness who could tell his story, tell what happened to all of these victims, and, they were not even sure he'd be able to make it to do so. But if his health wasn't scaring the investigators, it was also the fact that this killer could possibly come back and finish what he had tried to do previously, because it appeared as though this killer had believed that Jose was already dead. He hadn't just left him to survive. So they positioned officers around his room, inside his room of this hospital, every single moment of every day. 24/7, they had their eyes on him. But with 2 shootings in the same area, the public knew what was happening. It wasn't something that the investigators could hide from them in order to make sure that there wasn't any fear amongst the community. They knew what was happening, and it made it very hard for employees of these fast food restaurants to want to go in. And so many of them started to quit, and even if they didn't have a backup plan or didn't have another job, they decided that it wasn't worth it to risk their lives. So they started to quit, and nobody was wanting to go in to eat at these restaurants, and teenagers who worked there were not allowed to go in. Their parents said that they were not going to work any longer until this person was caught. 2 weeks later, Jose would be awake, and everyone was so excited. Investigators, the public, they were ecstatic that he had survived, but now they needed to question him. And at this point, he was awake, but he could only really move his eyes and his hands and his fingers. So they used that to their advantage, and they, asked him, move this finger to say if he was white, or move this finger to say if he was black. And so that's what they did to get a few of the questions and answers out of him. And so they found that there was only one man, and he was white. Now, that is all they could really get out of him at that point. They didn't want to push it any farther because he was still healing, but it wouldn't be long before he could answer more questions in detail and tell what really happened. But by this point, investigators already believed that the case of McDonald's shootings and the case of Captain D's shootings were connected. When Jose was comfortable talking and could do it without it being detrimental to his health, he told the story. And he said that night that the 4 employees were all closing up, they were walking outside, and that is when a man came at them with a gun. He came out of nowhere and he forced them back into the McDonald's, back to the back of the storeroom, and he lined them up and began to shoot them. Now, right before this, he had actually asked Ronald to open the safe, who was the manager, and he did so. And then he was shooting them one by one, and Jose was last. And that is when a miracle would happen, because this killer's gun would jam, and he would no longer be able to shoot Jose. And as he was trying to work with his gun, Jose jumped up and attacked him, trying to get him to stop. But unfortunately, this killer had a backup plan and took out a knife and began to stab Jose 17 times. By this point, Jose said he just pretended he was dead. He laid completely still, tried not to breathe, and just played dead. And thankfully this worked, because the killer then went to the safe, got all the money, and he left. And that is when Jose could actually go to the phone as he was bleeding and in so much pain, and he could call 911. However, now they had a bit of a problem, because Jose would work with a sketch artist as well to come up with the image of the man who had done this to him. And it kind of differed slightly to the one that the employees at Captain D's had made. Although, I heard that it differed, and in a lot of the sources it says this. However, when I looked at these 2 sketches, I could see some similarities, the nose and the way the mouth was. So, there were some differences, but there were also some similarities. I think at this point, nobody really knew whether they were connected or not. And so it was confusing a lot of people, and they were still trying to figure things out, because they had yet to solve either case, and they were basically working on gut instincts and doing what they thought was right without really knowing. At this point, investigators started to act as if the killer was going to strike again, and they weren't just going to sit around and wait for it to happen. So they started putting out officers at restaurants. They were patrolling every single area where there was a fast food restaurant, hoping they would catch this killer in the act and bring him to justice. Unfortunately, that is not what happened, because they didn't find him. He didn't show, as if he knew they were waiting for him. Or was it possibly that this was his motive and it just wasn't time yet? You see, he had waited a month between the Captain D's murders and the McDonald's murders. So, did they just need to wait that month for him to strike again? Thankfully, they still wanted to be prepared, and they were still patrolling these areas through all of this time, but it would be his usual MO of a month later. And it was April 23rd, exactly a month later to the day since the murders in McDonald's. And he would strike again at a Baskin Robbins on Wilma Rudolph Boulevard in Clarksville, which was an hour outside of Nashville. There were 2 employees working that night shift that night, and this was 21-year-old Angela Holmes and 16-year-old Michelle Mace. And Michelle had actually called her mom prior to closing up the restaurant, saying that she needed a ride home and that she would also love potato soup for dinner that night. And her mom kind of joked around and said, "Potato soup? I'm not making you that." And she said, "Please, Mom, I'm really hungry. That sounds really good." And her mom seemed to have a really good relationship. So finally her mom said, "Yes, I'll make you some soup, and I'll also send your brother to pick you up." And so that is when Michelle would tell her, "A customer just walked in. I gotta go. I love you." And her mom would say, "I love you back," without knowing this would be the last conversation she would ever have with her daughter. Michelle was said to be quite the talker who wanted to be a marine biologist, but also always said that she was going to be famous one day. And she just had that natural, loving, beautiful, bubbly personality. Angela was actually a wife as well as a mother to a baby, and on top of that, she was going to nursing school while working part-time at Baskin Robbins to make some money. It was said she was a natural overachiever and she was extremely smart as well as well-liked. Michelle's brother would show up at Baskin Robbins 10 minutes later to pick up his sister, and he waited for a while, and the lights were on inside, and he would just kind of be waiting when he realized that he couldn't see anyone moving around inside. Not Angela, not Michelle, no customers. And that is when he called his mom and he said, "Something's strange. I can't see anyone inside." And that is when he got out and he walked up to the door and realized it was still unlocked. Yet Michelle was nowhere to be seen. That is when he called the police and they would head inside to find that it was empty. And there were also empty cash drawers in the register. This had been a robbery and now was thought to be a kidnapping. It was thought that if this was connected to the murders at Captain D's and McDonald's, that this man was now upping his MO. He was not just killing them on sight, he was abducting them. And who knows what he was going to do with them next. So a search went out the next morning to search for these two young girls with their lives ahead of them, and they would be found shortly after by a man who was walking around Dunbar Cave Park. He would find a body in the water as well as a body nearby in the woods, and this in fact was Angela and Michelle, and unfortunately, they had not survived. Both had stab wounds and their throats had been cut. In fact, Angela had 14 stab wounds and Michelle had almost been decapitated. A witness came forward saying that she had been at Baskin Robbins right before closing, and she had walked in as a customer and then left, and they were closing around that time, but a car pulled up that was a red car and she noticed it as she left. And then another witness said around the time that they would have been abducted, he had seen a red car at Dunbar Cave Park where they were found. So at this point they realized this was a huge tip, one that they did not have before, so they started setting up roadblocks in the area to try to find this red car. But once again, it was like he already knew that they were doing this because this car was not found. They would have to wait 6 weeks later, a month and a half, to know anything more. And this was on June 1st, and a man named Mitch Roberts would call the police and have a story to tell that was almost unbelievable. And he would say that he actually had an employee come to his house that night and basically want his job back. You see, Mitch was the owner of a Shoney's restaurant, and he had let go of this certain employee a little while back, and his name was Paul Reid. And he said that Paul came up to his door. It was in the middle of the night. I mean, they were still awake, but it was dark outside. And he came to their door, and that is when Mitch's wife took their son to another room and said, "Get rid of this guy. He's creeping me out." And so Mitch was like, "Look, I'll talk to you about it in the morning. You know, we can discuss what we can do. You can probably get your job back, but it's not going to be tonight." But Paul was insistent that he knew something, and that he knew that someone was stealing from Shoney's. And of course, Mitch, being this owner, this manager, needed to know what this was all about and if someone was really stealing from him. And so Paul said, "Look, I have the evidence, the proof in the back of my trunk. If you'll just come back there with me, I can show you real quick and then we can move on from this." And so reluctantly, Mitch went outside with him, peered into the back of the trunk, and saw prepackaged steaks that were from Shoney's that somebody had obviously stolen. And so that is when he said, "We'll deal with this tomorrow. It's late." And he started walking back to his house, but that was when he would have a gun in his face, and Paul would be throwing handcuffs at him, telling him to put on the handcuffs. And Mitch was so shocked and terrified, but he knew he had a wife and a son inside he needed to protect, and he told him no. He told him, "I'm going inside." And so he started walking back to the front of his house. And that is when he looked back to see that Paul was still following him, now holding a knife as well. And Mitch knew he couldn't let Paul into his home, and so he whipped around and he shoved him to the ground before running inside the house and closing the door, holding it shut. But this didn't stop Paul. He was still trying to get inside this door, and so the only thing Mitch could think of to do was to scream, "Get me the gun. It's right there. Just hand me the gun." And he continued to scream this, and Paul finally got scared and ran away. And this was all a lie too. It was a ruse that worked because Mitch didn't have a gun. Thankfully, his plan did work and his family was safe, but he felt like he needed to call the police after that. And he was so confused because he had known Paul, and when he worked for him, he was said to be a well-mannered type of guy who always said yes sir, did anything you asked of him, came in, early if he needed to, late if he needed to. Anything he had to do, he was willing to. And this was a complete 180 as far as his behavior. Mitch would then file a report with investigators at his home, but just as they were about to leave, he would get a phone call. And this was from none other than 39-year-old Paul Reid. And he would be profusely apologizing, saying he was sorry for what he did and that he would love to come back over and make it up to Mitch. And of course, Mitch was reluctant of inviting him back over, but investigators quietly told him to do so because he would not be alone this time. They would be right there to help. The family then waited for their attacker to show back up because he was invited to their home this time, and that is when he would. And thankfully, investigators swarmed and they arrested him. This time, he came in a pickup truck with another male and was brought in for interrogation. Paul Reid was charged with the attempted kidnapping of Mitch Roberts, and that is when Mitch filled the investigators in on why he had fired Paul in the first place. And he had said that earlier that year in February, Paul just kind of completely changed, and he had thrown a dish at a female coworker and injured her, and he just started doing little things like this that were completely out of character. And Mitch said, "We can't have that here. I have to let you go." The day he was fired, was the day before the murders of Steve and Sarah at Captain D's. It seemed as though they had more than just an attempted kidnapper on their hands, and that they might have a serial killer in custody. Shockingly enough, Paul Reid had already committed crimes like these when they started looking into his criminal history. You see, his full name was Paul Dennis Reid Jr., and he was born in Houston, Texas. By the age of 26, it was 1983, and a steakhouse in Houston would be robbed. He was not wearing any sort of mask, and the customers and employees whom he didn't kill would identify him. He actually didn't kill anyone at this point. He just robbed the place, but they identified him as the robber, and he would be taken to trial. He would actually be sentenced to 20 years, but he would only serve 7 of those. When he got out in 1990, that is when he moved to Nashville because he was determined to become a country singer. But unfortunately for any of those who had to listen to his demo, he was not a singer and was not going to make it very far. So 7 years after he was released from prison for robbery, he was being looked at in the murder of 7 people, as well as robbery of 3 different restaurants. During the interrogation, he really showed some very odd behavior, things that I had never really seen from a criminal interrogation before. He was very, very friendly, overly friendly. And he started saying that if he was the killer, he didn't want them, the investigators, to look at him any differently because he was still a human, and that he didn't want to tarnish a possible relationship with them. And he was really concerned about, a possible relationship with the investigators and wanted them to like him. But when he was asked, are you the killer? You're saying if I'm the killer, but are you? He would say, oh no, I'm just, saying if I was. All of the investigators said that looking within his eyes, there was no kindness, no friendliness, no warmth within them. There was no emotion at all. Paul's father was actually a private detective as well as an alcoholic. Digging more into Paul's past, his parents actually divorced at 3 years old and he started living with his father. However, his grandmother was more of the person who raised him because his father worked so many jobs and couldn't watch them all the time. and so his grandmother was in charge of him. He was said to start stealing from the neighbors at a very early age. He also did pranks on his grandmother that weren't pranks. They were things that you could say, he's just a kid, he's pranking, that's what they do. But, you know, looking closer, it's definitely signs of something wrong. He would put thumbtacks in his grandmother's soup so she would eat them, which of course is going to damage your body, no matter what. And he also locked her in her bedroom often, wouldn't let her out. He also set her bed on fire while she was sleeping in it. Animals were also often harmed by him, and I won't go into detail about that. But like I always say, serial killers start somewhere, and it seems like Paul started from a very early age. It was just somehow some sort of miracle that he didn't start killing that early. Or did he? We don't really know. You know, it was also found that Paul had a lot of injuries to his head, even from a young age. At 5, he was hit in the head with a brick. At 12, he fractured his skull in a bike accident, and then during this time, he was also hit by a car and he went into the windshield head first, which of course is going to cause some sort of damage. And when he was 16, he was actually kicked out of his family home because he had assaulted his sisters and his mother, sexually assaulted them. And at 19, he was actually charged with robbing a supermarket, but the charges were dropped because they said he was legally insane. By 23, he got another concussion from a car accident he was in. And you know, all of this is said to, of course, cause damage to the brain. But of course, we have seen that different serial killers, when they have damage to their frontal lobe, whether that's, you know, during pregnancy, from, you know, fetal alcohol syndrome where the mother is drinking, whether that is from some sort of damage that their head has as a baby or growing up, that it can really damage your ability to choose right from wrong. It can damage your ability to have empathy. And it's often said that serial killers can be made from people who have damage to their brains. Investigators needed more concrete evidence to connect him to the murders at Captain D's, McDonald's, and Baskin Robbins, and so that is when they started looking deeper, and they found that Paul had actually bought gas at a gas station near the Baskin Robbins that same night, putting him in the area, which of course would have been harder to do because he did live an hour away. But if it showed that he was in that area, of course, that connected him further. They also searched his red car and found forensic evidence from the victims. I'm not sure which ones, but some of the victims' evidence was found inside his car, as well as blood from them was found on his shoes. Paul's fingerprints were also tested against the partial fingerprint on Steve Hampton's cards, and it was a match. Now, Jose Gonzalez, the McDonald's survivor, well, he would be shown a lineup and he would pick Paul out of it as being his attacker and the killer of his employees. And that is when investigators searched Paul's home and found jars full of thousands and thousands of coins, some of which he would have stolen from these restaurants. Quickly, these cases were all being solved at once. It was found that Paul had gone to Captain D's that day with his application in order to get in the door. And of course, when Steve saw he had an application, he opened the door for him just to give it to him. And that is when Paul completely changed and turned on Steve and Sarah. With the money he got from McDonald's, he bought a brand new car from the same dealership that he had gone to a little while before, and they said he didn't have enough money to buy something, but then after this, he went to the dealership and bought a brand new car. And a month later, he went to the McDonald's and he purposely waited until the employees were, not on guard anymore. They were leaving, they were having a good time, they were relaxed, ready to go home. And that is when he attacked them and forced them back inside. A month after that, he headed to the Baskin Robbins and he tried to get in, but the door was already locked because they had closed. However, he knocked, he begged the girls to let him in, to give him, some ice cream real quick, and that is when they did so. And unfortunately, that's when he also pulled the gun. And it's thought that this is when Michelle was saying, "My brother is coming to pick me up, he's going to see you," and just kind of warning this killer. And that is when he kind of freaked out, and that is why he abducted them, took them in his car, and took them to the Dunbar Cave Park, because he knew that Michelle's brother was going to be there. The reason why Angela and Michelle's bodies were said to be far apart was because Angela was killed first in the water, and while he was doing that, Michelle ran, and unfortunately he caught up to her in the woods and made her pay for running. By 2000, Paul Reid was taken to trial, many different trials, but he was ultimately found guilty of 7 murders and given 7 death sentences. Now, this was the most ever handed down to a single person in the state of Tennessee, but during the trial, Paul was showing some very odd behavior. He was extremely paranoid. He said that his defense team were all actors pretending to work for him, and he also said that the US government had recruited him for a mind control program, and that basically now they were watching his every move. It was called scientific technology, and everything he did, they were watching to see, why he did what he did and what came after that. Paul's family said he was actually mentally incompetent to stand his trial, and his sister got on the stand and said he was acting very strange before all these murders started happening. In fact, his father had died previous to this, and he had gone to his funeral in very casual clothes, not in, black dressy like you're supposed to. They were just very casual. He was also wearing a Burger King crown, those little paper crowns that you can get. He was wearing one of those, and he was also calling himself King Paul at his father's funeral. He was also known to wear a cloth over his head at random times to keep the demons out. However, when Paul was examined psychologically, they found that he was actually playing the system, and that he was much smarter and capable than he was letting on. That it was basically all an act. But throughout the years, of course, with all the crimes that he had done in the past, all of his actions when he was a child, he has been tested many different times. He's been diagnosed with many different things, but then other people say he's completely mentally competent, and others have found that his frontal lobe was damaged, which, like I said, is something that is found in killers sometimes. But basically his defense said he had a broken brain, and nobody can really say for sure what all is wrong with him, or if it is just some sort of crazy manipulation that he is using, that he tried to use to get out of what he had done. Throughout the years, he was granted several stays of execution, which just pushed back his execution more and more, and he also appealed some verdicts but didn't appeal the others, which, since they were all death sentences, if he didn't appeal them all, it didn't really matter. But it was said that that was kind of his odd behavior again, that sometimes he was all for trying to fight and trying not to have the death sentence, but then other times he was like, no, I deserve it and I'm going to go through with it. And it was just, a back and forth. On death row, he still continued to say he was not guilty. That never really changed. But by 2013, he had spent 13 years in prison when he actually would pass away of pneumonia and heart problems. And he had been in the hospital for 2 weeks before that. But Paul at one point was also the prime suspect of murders that happened in 1993, and that was between the time he got out of jail and the time of the Captain D murder, so he would have been able to do this. And it was in Palatine, Illinois, and it was known as the Brown's Chicken Massacre. And Paul was looked into for this because it was done at a fast food restaurant. It was at the Brown's Chicken and Pasta, and 2 of the owners and 5 of the employees were killed. They were shot to death. There was also a robbery that happened of $2,000, and it sounded a lot like Paul's MO, right? Well, shoe prints that were said to match Paul were also found at this crime scene. Some really believed that Paul had done these as well. However, 9 years later, they would actually find a killer, and it was not Paul, and in fact was another man with the same MO. And if you'd like me to do a whole video on the Brown's Chicken Massacre, I haven't seen anyone do it on YouTube before, so if you want me to do it, just let me know down below, and I definitely can. But that isn't the only other murder case that Paul was thought to be a part of. I mean, do you think Paul killed more than 7 people? Because it was speculated that he could have killed 3 more. This was in 1980 at a bowling alley in Houston, Texas, where he was from, when it was said that a man walked up at closing time and forced the employees back in the building. A man had forced the employees who were leaving to go back inside, saying that he needed a jug of water for his car. And that is when the employees let him in as they were finishing up their duties, and he would shoot 3 of them. He would also rob the store. Now, a man who was named Max Sofar was actually convicted and sentenced for these crimes. However, many believe he was not guilty. Max was sentenced to death, but there were so many things that pointed to Paul having a connection to this case. You see, investigators had found cards belonging to the victims and different belongings belonging to the victims on the side of the road, just like Steve Hampton's cards. There was also a witness who came forward much later on saying that he had been at the bowling alley that night prior to this happening, and he had seen a man who was kicked out of the bowling alley, and he threatened to come back and kill everyone. He identified this man as Paul Reid. So many believe that Paul was the real killer, and that Max Sofar was wrongly convicted. What do you think? This would have happened 17 years before he had murdered at Captain D's. However, we know that he has a very dark history. So, is it similar enough for you to believe that he was the real killer? I'd love to hear your theories on that one below. But I'm happy that I can talk about these victims as well as the ones who survived, because, I think especially Mitch and his entire family, they had to be so scared, and inviting him back to their home knowing, anything could have happened must have been so frightening. And especially Jose, who had to just pretend he was dead after attacking this man. It takes a lot of strength, and to me that's so beautiful. And I just love to tell the stories of people who don't get enough of a spotlight. We hear a lot about celebrities and, the rich, the wealthy, but people who didn't get to finish their lives because some horrific act took that away, or people who had to fight to keep their lives when they shouldn't have had to be put in that situation at all, those are the people that I look up to. So, hope you're doing well. Hope you're staying safe. Don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. If you need someone to talk to, just comment something down below, and we can all talk and, keep each other company, keep each other sane, and make sure that we're not feeling too alone. Because you're not alone. Okay? Bye.